There is a universe inside of you. It is as vast and as silent as the cosmos, filled with 100 trillion stars we call cells, each one a world unto itself, burning with a quiet, metabolic fire. They are bound together by forces you do not feel, communicating in a language you will never hear, a chemical whisper that travels along rivers of blood and pathways of nerve. This is the first reality, the one beneath your skin. And in this universe, there is a constant and ancient war. It is a conflict without malice, a struggle as fundamental as gravity, as inevitable as the turning of the planets. It is the war between order and chaos, between the improbable, breathtaking architecture of life and the relentless, patient pull of entropy. We have given the face of chaos 1,000 names. Sickness, disease, malaise, the affliction. But it is, in its essence, simply the universe remembering its preference for simplicity, for dust. And on the other side of this war, there is another force. A force just as ancient, just as persistent. It is the insistence of the system to remain a system. The quiet, stubborn refusal of the cells to fall apart. The elegant, ferocious response of the organism to protect its own integrity. We call this healing. We call it recovery. We call it life itself. This is the story of that war. Not a story of generals and kings, but of whispers and observations. It is the story of humanity standing at the edge of this internal cosmos, peering in. It is the story of our long, fumbling, and beautiful attempt to become an ally to the light, to lend our own clumsy hands to the intricate work of healing, to understand the science of our own sickness. We begin in darkness, not a literal darkness, but the profound darkness of not knowing. The darkness of a world where the body is a sealed box, a sacred and terrifying mystery. In this world, sickness is not a biological process. It is a judgment. It is a ghost that has slipped between the ribs. It is a malevolent spirit, whispering poisons into the ear of the soul. It is a punishment from a displeased God, or a curse woven on the threads of a stray lock of hair. How do you fight a ghost? How do you bargain with a God you cannot see? You answer a mystery with a mystery. You answer a spiritual affliction with a spiritual cure. The first healers were not scientists. They were shamans, mystics, and priests. They were the intermediaries between the world you could see and the vast, terrifying world you could not. Their medicine was the medicine of symbols. A bitter herb was chosen not for its chemical properties, but because its bitterness was thought to frighten away bitter spirits. A red flower was used to treat an ailment of the blood, a simple poetry of color and form. Chants were sung, not to alter the patient's physiology, but to realign their soul with the harmony of the cosmos. Incense was burned to purify the air not of germs, which were not yet even a dream, but of invisible miasmas, of foul spiritual stenches. And sometimes it worked, not always for the reasons they believed, but it worked. The willow bark tea they brewed for a fever did, in fact, contain a precursor to aspirin. The calming ritual they performed did, in fact, lower the frantic pulse of a terrified patient, allowing the body's own quiet work to proceed. The moldy bread poultice they applied to a wound did, in fact, contain a crude, wild form of penicillin. They were right for all the wrong reasons. Or perhaps they were simply speaking a different dialect of the same fundamental language of healing. They were listening. They were watching. They saw a pattern, a correspondence between a plant and a symptom, between a ritual and a recovery. They were the first to codify this knowledge, to pass it down through generations not as data, but as sacred story, as holy writ. This was the first pharmacopoeia, written not in ink, but spoken on the wind and etched into memory. Yet, there was a more direct approach, a more terrifying one. For the sicknesses that were believed to reside within the head, the madness, the seizures, the ceaseless, pounding headaches, a more dramatic intervention was sometimes deemed necessary. If a demon was trapped inside the skull, you did not try to coax it out with a pleasant-smelling smoke. You opened a door. This is trepanation, the slow, careful drilling of a hole into the living bone of the cranium. Imagine the scene. The patient, held down, perhaps stupefied with alcohol or opium, perhaps simply resigned to their fate. The healer, with a sharpened piece of flint or an obsidian knife, begins to scrape, and scrape, and scrape. The sound of it, a dull grating, a slow excavation of the very house of consciousness. The goal was not to touch the brain, that soft, pulsating mystery. The goal was simply to create an exit, to let the pressure out, to let the demon escape into the light. We look back on this with a shudder. We call it barbaric, primitive. But look closer. In the skulls of those who survived, we see the bone has healed, grown smooth around the edges of the hole. This means people lived through this. It means that, for some, it must have provided a kind of relief. For a brain swelling against the unyielding prison of the skull, for the crushing pressure of a subdural hematoma from a blow to the head, this brutal act of creating a release valve may have been the only thing that could have saved a life. They were performing a crude neurosurgery without knowing what a neuron was. They were, again, stumbling upon a truth in the dark. This was the state of things for millennia. A world of ghosts and herbs, of prayers and holes drilled in bone. The body was a black box, and medicine was a collection of stories we told ourselves about what might be happening inside it. There was no anatomy, only sacred geography. There was no physiology, only the ebb and flow of invisible spirits. To look inside was a taboo, a desecration. The dead were to be respected, to be returned to the earth hole. And so, the living remained a mystery. What does it take to change a world? Sometimes it takes a shift in belief, a new way of seeing. For medicine, that shift began not with a doctor, but with the philosophers of ancient Greece. They began to ask a different kind of question. What if sickness was not a punishment from the gods, but a natural phenomenon? What if the body was not governed by spirits, but by principles, by laws that could be understood? Hippocrates is the name we remember. He is called the father of medicine, not because he discovered a great cure, but because he proposed a great idea, the idea of methodical observation. He taught his followers to watch the patient, not the stars, to record the symptoms, to note the progression of the illness, to feel the heat of the skin, to taste the sweetness of the urine, to study the nature of the fluids the body produced. He insisted that disease had a physical, rational cause. He was wrong, of course, about the specifics. He and his followers proposed the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was the perfect balance of these four fluids. Sickness was an imbalance. Too much phlegm caused cold. Too much black bile caused melancholy. The cure, therefore, was to restore the balance, to drain the excess, to purge, to bleed. For the next 1,500 years, this idea would dominate Western medicine. It was an elegant theory, a complete system. It had a pleasing symmetry, and it gave the healer something to do. If a patient was feverish, their blood was clearly too hot, too abundant. The solution was obvious. Let some of it out. The lancet and the leech became the most common tools of the trade. Patients were bled for everything from pneumonia to a broken heart. They were purged with powerful emetics and laxatives to rid the body of excess bile. This was a step forward, a monumental one, because it moved medicine from the realm of the supernatural to the realm of the natural. But it was a step onto a path that led, for centuries, in the wrong direction. The logic was sound, but the premise was a fiction. The body is not a vessel of four humors. In draining a patient weakened by infection of their precious, oxygen-carrying blood was not a cure. It was, in many cases, a death sentence delivered with the best of intentions. The grip of this idea was absolute. It was elaborated upon by the Roman physician Galen, who became the unquestionable authority. He did perform dissections, but only on animals, pigs, and primates. He mapped their anatomy and, with breathtaking confidence, assumed that human anatomy was identical. His prolific writings became the gospel of medicine, and for more than a millennium, to question Galen was to question reality itself. The human body remained a mystery. We were treating a machine we had never seen the schematics for, based on an instruction manual written for a different model entirely. The quiet universe within remained terra incognita, and the ghosts of Hippocrates and Galen stood guard at its borders, forbidding entry. For 1,000 years, the map remained the same. The four humors ruled the sickbed. The wisdom of Galen was copied and recopied in monastic scriptoriums, his errors enshrined as doctrine. To be a great physician was not to discover something new, but to know the ancient texts most intimately. It was a science of commentary, not of investigation. The body was still a sacred text, but now the priests were doctors, and the scripture was Galen. Then came the Renaissance. A wind of change began to blow through Europe. A new spirit of humanism, a renewed interest in the world as it is, not as it was described in ancient books. Artists obsessed with capturing the human form with lifelike precision needed to know what lay beneath the skin. They needed to understand the architecture of muscle and bone that gave the body its shape and grace. Think of Leonardo da Vinci, an artist, yes, but also an engineer, an inventor, a restless, insatiably curious mind. In secret, by candlelight, he violated the great taboo. He peeled back the skin of human cadavers, forgotten souls from the charity hospitals, and he looked. He did not see four humors. He saw a machine of such exquisite complexity and beauty that it humbled him. He drew what he saw: the branching filigree of the bronchial tree, the elegant, four-chambered pump of the heart, the intricate knot of the intestines, the delicate scaffolding of the skeleton. His drawings were not just art. They were acts of scientific rebellion. He was charting the unknown country. But his notebooks remained private, hidden for centuries. The revolution he started was a silent one. The man who would shout that revolution from the rooftops was a young, ambitious physician from Brussels named Andreas Vesalius. He, too, was taught the unshakable truth of Galen. But when he performed his own dissections, a profound and dangerous cognitive dissonance began to set in. The body on his table did not match the body in the book. Galen described a human jaw made of two bones, like a dog's. Vesalius could only find one. Galen described a liver with 5 lobes, like a pig's. Vesalius saw only 2. He was faced with a choice that echoes through the history of science. Trust the authority of 1,000 years, or trust the evidence of your own eyes. Vesalius chose his eyes. He chose the cold, silent truth of the corpse on the table over the warm, celebrated wisdom of the library. In 1543, he published his masterpiece, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. It was an earthquake. It was a declaration of independence for the science of medicine. It was filled with hundreds of breathtakingly detailed woodcut illustrations, showing the human body as it truly was. The layered muscles of the torso peeled back one by one, the delicate bones of the hand, the coiled labyrinth of the brain. It was a book that said, "Do not take my word for it. Do not take Galen's word for it. Look for yourself." Vesalius tore down the old map. He proved that the body was not a theoretical construct, but a physical place. A place that could be explored, charted, and understood. He gave us the first true atlas of the human universe. But an atlas is not the same as a travel guide. Knowing where the rivers and mountains are does not tell you how they work. The map was there, but it was static. The land was still silent. The next step was to hear the country breathe, to feel its pulse. This required another kind of leap from anatomy, the study of structure, to physiology, the study of function. The man who made that leap was an English physician named William Harvey. He, too, was obsessed with the heart. Galen had taught that the liver created blood from food, and the heart simply warmed it and pushed it out to the body, where it was consumed like fuel. It was a one-way trip. But Harvey was a man of numbers. He calculated how much blood the heart's chambers could hold. He measured the pulse. He multiplied, and he arrived at a staggering conclusion. In a single hour, the heart pumped out a quantity of blood that far exceeded the weight of a man. It was impossible for the liver to be producing it that fast. It was impossible for the body to be consuming it. The blood could not be on a one-way trip. It had to be on a round trip. It had to be circulating. It was a radical, almost heretical idea. Harvey proposed that the heart was a pump, a powerful muscle that propelled the blood through the arteries, out to the limbs and organs, and that it then returned through a different set of vessels, the veins, to be pumped out again. A ceaseless, closed loop. A river that flows forever back to its own source. He showed this with simple, elegant experiments. He would tie off an artery in a living animal and watch the vessel swell on the side, leading to the heart. He would tie off a vein and watch it swell on the side, leading away from the heart. He showed the tiny valves in the veins of the human arm, proving they would only allow blood to flow in one direction, back toward the heart. The body was no longer a static map. It was a dynamic system. It had a rhythm, a flow. It was a machine, yes, but a living, breathing, pulsing one. Vesalius had given us the geography. Harvey gave us the weather. Yet, a fundamental mystery remained. How did the blood get from the arteries to the veins? Harvey predicted there must be tiny, invisible passages connecting them, but he could not see them. His universe still had a frontier he could not cross. The smallest, most intimate workings of the machine were still hidden from view. To see them, humanity would need a new eye. An eye capable of peering into a world smaller than a grain of sand. A world teeming with a form of life no one had ever imagined. The next great leap into the internal cosmos did not come from a doctor or university professor. It came from a Dutch draper, a man of commerce named Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. He was not a scientist by trade, but he was possessed by a singular obsession to make the most perfect, most powerful magnifying lenses in the world. He would grind and polish for hours, creating tiny glass beads that could magnify objects hundreds of times. He was a man driven by pure, unadulterated curiosity. He put everything he could find under his new, magical eye. The sting of a bee, the fibers of a muscle, the eye of a fly. He looked at the world, and the world transformed. It became deeper, more complex, more wonderfully strange than anyone had ever dreamed. And then, one day, he looked at a drop of pond water. He expected to see nothing but water. Instead, he saw a carnival. He saw a bustling, writhing, miniature world. He described little animals, or animalcules, darting and tumbling through the water. They were, he wrote with astonishment, 1,000 times smaller than the smallest ones I have ever seen. He had discovered microorganisms. He was the first human being to witness the teeming, invisible life that surrounds us and, as we would learn, pervades us. He looked at the plaque scraped from between his own teeth. He found another zoo, a writhing mass of tiny rods and corkscrews. He was looking at bacteria. He had no idea what they were, what they did. He didn't connect them to disease. How could he? They were simply a source of wonder, a testament to the infinite creativity of nature. He was an explorer charting a new continent, a continent that existed in a single drop of water. For almost 200 years, his discovery remained a curiosity, a marvel for the amateur scientist, a parlor trick for the wealthy. The connection between these little animals and the great, sweeping plagues that regularly decimated human populations was a leap no one was prepared to make. Sickness was still a matter of imbalance, of miasmas, of foul airs rising from swamps and filth. The idea that something so small could kill something so large was absurd. The operating theaters of the 18th and 19th centuries were places of profound contradiction. On one hand, surgery was becoming bolder, more ambitious. Anesthesia, in the form of ether and chloroform, had finally arrived, a gift of pure mercy that untethered the patient from the agony of the knife. Surgeons could now take their time, work carefully, perform procedures that would have been unthinkable on a conscious, screaming patient. But these theaters were also temples of death. Surgeons would operate in their street clothes, a coat stained with the blood and pus of 100 previous operations worn as a badge of honor, a sign of experience. They would use unwashed hands and instruments. They would move from dissecting a corpse in the morgue to delivering a baby in the maternity ward without a thought. The very air was thick with what they called hospitalism, a vague, mysterious poison that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. A simple fracture could be a death sentence. A routine amputation had a mortality rate that would be unimaginable today. Patients who survived the surgery itself would often succumb days later to a raging fever, their wounds swelling with pus, their bodies consumed by what was called ward fever or puerperal fever in maternity hospitals. It was a terrible paradox. The very place you want to be healed was the place most likely to kill you. A young Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, working in the Vienna General Hospital, was tormented by this paradox. He observed a horrifying pattern. The maternity ward run by doctors and medical students, who also spent their time in the autopsy room, had a mortality rate 3 times higher than the ward run by midwives, who did not. He hypothesized that the doctors were carrying cadaverous particles on their hands from the dead to the living. It was an intuitive leap, not yet grounded in a full theory, but it was a powerful one. He instituted a simple, radical policy. All doctors and students had to wash their hands in a chlorine solution before examining a patient. The results were immediate and miraculous. The death rate plummeted. It fell to the same level as the midwives' clinic. Semmelweis had found a way to stop the angel of death. And for this, he was ridiculed, mocked, and driven from his post. His ideas flew in the face of conventional wisdom. How could a gentleman's hands, even unwashed ones, carry such a deadly poison? It was an insult. He had the evidence, the numbers that saved lives. But he did not have a mechanism. He couldn't explain what the cadaverous particles were. He died in a mental asylum, ironically from an infected wound, a victim of the very ignorance he had fought so hard to dispel. The mechanism would be provided by a French chemist, a man who was not a doctor at all, Louis Pasteur. He was asked to solve a practical problem for the French wine industry. Why was their wine spoiling? Using his microscope, he saw that the good wine was full of yeast cells, but the sour, spoiled wine was contaminated with other, smaller microbes, bacteria. He theorized that these tiny organisms were not spontaneously generating from the wine, as was commonly believed, but were coming from the air. And he proved it with a beautifully simple experiment. He boiled broth in a flask with a long, swan-like neck. The neck was open to the air, but its curves would trap any dust or microbes floating in. The broth remained sterile, clear. But if he broke the neck off, allowing the air and its invisible passengers to fall directly in, the broth would quickly become cloudy, teeming with life. He had proven it. Life comes from life. And if these tiny organisms could spoil wine and sour milk, what could they do to the far more complex liquid of the human body? Pasteur's work gave birth to the germ theory of disease. The invisible miasma was not a gas. It was a swarm of living things. The cadaverous particles of Semmelweis were bacteria. The enemy finally had a face, even if it was a microscopic one. Across the channel, an English surgeon named Joseph Lister read Pasteur's work and had an epiphany. If germs in the air were causing putrefaction in flasks, perhaps they were also causing it in surgical wounds. He began to experiment with carbolic acid, a harsh disinfectant, spraying it into the air of his operating room, soaking his instruments in it, applying it to the wounds of his patients. The effect was as dramatic as Semmelweis's hand-washing. His wards, once rife with the stench of gangrene, began to smell of carbolic acid instead, and his patients began to live. He had transformed the brutal craft of surgery into something approaching a science. He had declared war not on the body, but on the invisible invaders that plagued it. Antisepsis and, later asepsis, the prevention of contamination in the first place, was born. The age of clean, safe surgery could begin. Now the hunt was on. If specific germs caused specific diseases, then the next task was to identify the culprits, to create a taxonomy of the invisible enemy. This work was spearheaded by a German doctor, a rival of Pasteur's named Robert Koch. He was a methodical, relentless investigator. He perfected the techniques of growing bacteria in pure cultures on petri dishes, using dyes to make them visible under the microscope and photographing them. He was a microbe hunter. He laid down a set of strict criteria, known as Koch's postulates, to prove that a specific microbe caused a specific disease. You had to find the microbe in every case of the disease. You had to isolate it and grow it in a pure culture. You had to infect a healthy animal with the culture and produce the same disease. And you had to recover the same microbe from the newly sick animal. With these tools, a new world was revealed. Koch identified the bacterium that causes anthrax. He found a bacillus responsible for tuberculosis, the white plague that had haunted humanity for centuries. His students and followers found the microbes for diphtheria, tetanus, pneumonia, gonorrhea, meningitis, and the plague. In just a few decades, the map of disease was redrawn. The old ghosts were exorcised, replaced by a rogues gallery of bacilli and cocci. It was a time of immense optimism, of scientific triumphalism. We had found the enemy. We could see it, grow it, understand its ways. Surely, now that we knew the cause, a cure would be simple. We just needed to find a way to kill the invader without killing the host. We needed a magic bullet. But before the bullet came the shield. The idea of protection, of teaching the body to defend itself, was an old one. For centuries, people in Asia and Africa had practiced variolation, deliberately infecting themselves with a small amount of pus from a mild case of smallpox to gain immunity. It was a dangerous gamble, a dance with death that sometimes went wrong. An English country doctor named Edward Jenner heard a piece of folklore, a dairymaid's boast. "I shall never have smallpox, for I have had cowpox." Cowpox was a mild disease, caught from cattle, that caused a few sores on the hands. Jenner was intrigued. Was it possible that an infection with this trivial disease could protect against the horrific scourge of smallpox? In 1796, he performed one of the most famous, and by modern standards, most unethical experiments in history. He took pus from a cowpox sore on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms and scratched it into the arm of a healthy 8-year-old boy, James Phipps, the son of his gardener. The boy developed a mild fever and a small sore, but quickly recovered. A few weeks later, Jenner faced a moment of terrifying truth. He deliberately exposed the boy to smallpox. He inoculated him with the deadly virus, but the boy remained healthy. The ghost of the cow had taught his body how to fight the dragon of the pox. Jenner called his new technique vaccination, from the Latin word for cow, vacca. He had discovered a way to present the body with a harmless picture of its enemy, allowing the internal army, the immune system, to train its soldiers and prepare its weapons in peacetime for a future war. Pasteur, building on Jenner's work, would later develop vaccines for anthrax and rabies, weakening the microbes in his lab to create safe, effective inoculations. The shield was being perfected. Humanity now had a way to prevent the great plagues before they even began. It was a victory not of conquest, but of education, a way of whispering a secret to the body's own deep wisdom. The shield was a miracle, but it could not protect those who were already sick. The hunt for the magic bullet continued. The German scientist Paul Ehrlich was obsessed with the idea. He worked with chemical dyes, noticing that certain dyes would selectively stain certain types of cells or microbes. If you could stain it, he reasoned, you could kill it. He imagined a compound that would be toxic to the invading microbe, but harmless to the human host. A Zauberkugel. He and his team began a long, arduous process of screening. They would synthesize a chemical compound, test it against a microbe, and if it failed, modify it slightly and test again. Compound number 606, an arsenic-based drug called salvarsan, proved effective against the spirochete that causes syphilis. It was highly toxic, difficult to administer, but it was the first truly effective chemotherapy. It was a proof of concept. The magic bullet was real. But the true revolution, the one that would change the world forever, came not from a systematic search, but from a moment of pure, dumb luck. A happy accident in the lab of a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming. In 1928, Fleming returned from a holiday to find a stack of petri dishes he had left on his bench. One was contaminated with a common blue-green mold, a species of penicillium. He was about to discard it, But then he noticed something strange. In a clear ring around the mold, the bacteria he had been growing, Staphylococcus, had been destroyed. The mold was producing something that was lethal to the bacteria. A juice, a substance. He called it penicillin. Fleming recognized the significance of his observation, but he was unable to isolate and purify the active compound. For a decade, penicillin remained a lab curiosity. It was not until the Second World War that a team of scientists at Oxford, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, took on the monumental task of turning Fleming's mold juice into a stable, mass-producible drug. Their success was total. Penicillin was a true miracle. It was astonishingly powerful against a wide range of bacteria and remarkably non-toxic to humans. Soldiers who would have died from infected wounds were saved. Patients dying of pneumonia, scarlet fever, and meningitis made miraculous recoveries. The age of antibiotics had begun. The sound of that new era was the quiet sigh of a fever breaking, the sudden end of a war that had been raging in the body for days or weeks. For a few golden decades, it felt like we had one. We had the shields of vaccination and the bullets of antibiotics. We had conquered the ancient microbial enemies. Life expectancy soared. Childhood mortality plummeted. Surgery became routine and safe. We had entered a new age of medicine, an age of supreme confidence, of technological mastery over the frailties of the flesh. We believed we were on the brink of conquering disease itself. But the universe is more clever than we are. The enemy is not a static target. It is a living, evolving system, and it fights back. The very magic of our bullets began to teach our enemies how to wear armor. The widespread, sometimes careless, use of antibiotics created an intense evolutionary pressure. The few bacteria that, by random mutation, had a natural resistance to a drug were the only ones to survive. They multiplied, passing on their resistance genes. We began to see the rise of superbugs, strains of bacteria resistant to our most powerful weapons. The war was not over. It had simply entered a new phase, an arms race between our chemical ingenuity and the relentless 4-billion-year-old engine of microbial evolution. And as we vanquished the great infectious plagues, a new set of enemies emerged from the shadows. Not invaders from the outside, but traitors from within. The diseases of long life, the diseases of lifestyle, the slow, creeping failures of the body's own systems. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, where the body's own defenses turn on itself in a tragic case of mistaken identity. Alzheimer's, where the very fabric of the self unravels. These are not diseases with a single, simple cause. They are not a microbe you can kill with a bullet. They are complex, multifactorial, woven into the very fabric of our genes, our environment, our choices. The elegant simplicity of the germ theory, which had served us so well, was no longer enough. The body was proving to be more than just a battlefield for external wars. It was a landscape where civil wars could erupt. And so, we had to look deeper. We had to turn the microscope inward, past the cell, past the organelle, to the most fundamental blueprint of all, the double helix of DNA. In 1953, Watson and Crick unveiled the structure of a molecule that carries the instructions for building and operating a living thing. The Book of Life was opened. The Human Genome Project, completed at the dawn of the 21st century, gave us the full text. A 3-billion-letter sequence that is the shared inheritance of our species. We could now, for the first time, read the code. And in that code, we found the typos, the misprints, the inherited vulnerabilities that predispose us to these new, chronic diseases. The enemy was not just an invader. Sometimes, the enemy was a part of our own story, a legacy from an ancestor we never knew. This new knowledge is transforming medicine once again. We are moving from the era of the magic bullet, designed for everyone, to the era of personalized medicine, tailored to the individual's unique genetic code. We can now design drugs to target the specific molecular pathways that have gone haywire in a particular cancer cell. We can predict a person's risk for a disease and recommend lifestyle changes to mitigate it. We are on the cusp of being able to edit the code itself, to correct the typos with technologies like CRISPR, a prospect of breathtaking promise and terrifying ethical complexity. We are moving from being soldiers fighting a war to being engineers and programmers, debugging the system. The tools have become unimaginably sophisticated. We can see inside the body without a knife, using the echoes of sound waves, the alignment of protons in a magnetic field, the decay of radioactive tracers. An MRI scan is a form of cartography, so detailed it would have seemed like pure sorcery to Vesalius. The surgeon's hand is no longer always a human hand. It can be the steady, precise pincers of a robot, controlled from across the room, making incisions smaller than a grain of rice. But as our knowledge has become deeper, our understanding has, in some ways, become more humble. We have learned that the body is not a simple machine to be fixed, but a complex, dynamic ecosystem. The trillions of microbes living in our gut, our microbiome, are not just passengers. They are essential partners in our health, digesting our food, training our immune system, even influencing our mood. The war metaphor begins to break down. We are not a fortress to be defended, but a garden to be tended. Sometimes, healing is not about killing, but about restoring balance. Not about pulling weeds, but about enriching the soil. And we have come full circle back to a mystery that the ancient shamans understood in their own way. The profound, undeniable connection between the mind and the body. We now have a name for it: psychoneuroimmunology. It is the scientific study of how our thoughts, our emotions, our stress, and our hope can translate into tangible, chemical changes in our nervous, endocrine, and immune systems. The placebo effect is no longer a dismissive term for a fake cure. It is a powerful demonstration of the brain's ability to act as its own pharmacy, to generate healing from belief. We are learning that loneliness can be as damaging to health as smoking, that social connection can be a potent medicine, that mindfulness and meditation can physically alter the brain and reduce inflammation. The healer's chant and the shaman's ritual find a faint, scientific echo in the therapist's office and the meditation hall. We are rediscovering that healing is not just something that is done to a patient. It is something that a patient does. So where are we now on this long, winding journey? We have traveled from a world of spirits to a world of atoms. From drilling a hole in the skull to let a demon out, to editing a single letter in the genetic code. We have amassed a power over sickness and health that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors. We have added decades to the human lifespan. We have made childbirth safe, vanquished plagues, and turned lethal infections into minor inconveniences. And yet, sickness remains. It is a shapeshifter. It evolves. As we solve one set of problems, a new one emerges. The universe inside us is still a universe, vast and filled with mysteries. For every answer we find, we uncover a dozen new, more subtle questions. What is consciousness, and how does it arise from the wet matter of the brain? Why do we age? Is death a disease to be cured, or a fundamental, necessary part of the definition of life? We have learned that healing is not a single act, but a spectrum. It is the sterile perfection of the robotic surgeon and the messy, hopeful chaos of the immune response. It is the elegant logic of a targeted drug and the profound, mysterious power of a hand held in comfort. It is the conquering of a virus, the management of a chronic condition, the acceptance of a terminal diagnosis with peace and dignity. The science of sickness has led us on an incredible odyssey, from the visible to the invisible, from the outside in, from the body as a whole to the molecules that write its story. But the art of healing remains what it has always been, an act of profound attention, of careful listening, of empathy. An act of one human being reaching out to another in their moment of fragility and saying, "You are not alone in this. We will face this mystery together." Listen, in the quiet of this moment, can you feel it? The silent, steady thrum of your own heart. The gentle, rhythmic tide of your own breath. That is the sound of the universe inside you, humming with the ceaseless, improbable work of being alive. It is the oldest story in the world, a story of resilience, a story of balance, a story of the endless, beautiful struggle to hold back the dust for one more day. And you, in this very moment, are its living, breathing, quietly triumphant chapter,